Hello, and welcome to the TRF Healing Connections podcast. I'm James Buffin, and in this episode, we'll be talking to Ed Tronick and Claudia Gold about attachment with a focus on their new book, The Power of Discord, why the ups and downs of relationships are the secret to building intimacy, resilience, and trust. Before we get to that, I want to share some things from the TRF newsletter that highlight important topics all related to the theme of this year's conference. Attachment. This week's featured article is called Building Attachment from the Bottom Up, Rhythms of Engagement Through Sensory Motor Play by Elizabeth Warner. She writes about how the origins of rhythms of engagement are the sensory and motor activities of the caregiver and the intentional movement and communicative responses of the child. These earliest activities have vestibular, proprioceptive, tactile, and rhythmic components that provide rich nutrients for the rapidly developing central nervous system. But this is also the way a caregiver and a child build an attachment. The article also has a simple, practical experiment you won't want to miss. Elizabeth Warner's work with children, youth, and families has focused attention on building rhythms of engagement between child and caregiver that are grounded in sensory motor play as a way to develop, repair, or enhance attachment bonds. It uses a therapeutic process called attachment building because it highlights the dynamic nature of full-body mutual engagement between child and adult. We encourage you to be part of the conversation in the TRF comments section. In that spirit, I have one more thing to share with you before the interview with Ed Tronick and Claudia Gold. Put June 21st in your calendars for the next quarterly virtual networking meeting for TRF members all around the globe. This is a unique opportunity to continue the conversation with your peers the world over. You can sign up by logging in to your TRF account page. And now it's my pleasure to bring you the interview with Ed Tronick and Claudia Gold. One of the key things that you write about is this concept of mismatch and repair in relationships that begins with infants and parents. I'm wondering if, for people who maybe aren't familiar with this model or haven't read the book yet, can you give some context for what that mismatch repair process is?
I started doing research on mother-infant interaction, probably about 30 years ago now. And the idea that we had at that time, and I think it's an idea that, or a view that people still have about how mothers and infants are interacting, is that everything's going to be synchronous. They're going to be in tune with one another. There's going to be a lot of positive affect between them. And that was the view that I had when we were looking at face-to-face interactions with mothers and babies. And then, very much to my surprise, what we began to see was that, in fact, the interactions, mothers playing with babies, wasn't as smooth as we thought it was going to be. That, in fact, there were lots and lots of mismatches, not only the baby looking away, but the mother looking away, or one of them having positive affect, the other having negative affect. So we began to think of those mismatches. And what we saw was that about 70% of the time, the interaction was actually in a mismatching state. And then about 30% of the time, it was in what we thought would be the typical part of the interaction, the matching. Mother smiling, infant smiling, both of them vocalizing together. So what I began to see was that the interaction, to choose a word, was kind of messy. It went from mismatching states to matching states. And what seemed then to be critical was how they repaired going from the mismatching state to the matching state. So we talk about repair theory, where the real process of connecting with another person, developing trust in another person, comes out of the ability to take that mismatch, so we're not together, and moving it into a matching state where we're both together and we're both sharing positive affect. And then typically what happens is you go into a mismatching state and then you come back into a repaired matching state.
Can you elaborate, either of you, please, on what's the experience? What's the lived experience of being in mismatch?
It's really a developmental process. And for babies, it's a very kind of bodily experience, like they don't have language for it. So it's more sort of a feeling. And then that's disorganizing in their body. And then when there is that moment of connection and repair, that's when their movements become calm and they become settled, and they develop that wonderful capacity for what we call self-regulation. So then in an adult going through that kind of mismatch repair process, there's much more thinking involved, but I would say it's still very much rooted in the body, in addition to being a more of a conscious process.
So 70% of the time is the norm for people to be in the state of mismatch. And is that also true, do you think, in adult relationships, core relationships?
I think if people just think about their interactions with someone they know well, there are all those times where the person's glancing off, or they say something and you don't quite understand what they're saying. And so you go back and forth, and we don't really notice it particularly. It's happening very quickly, but it's repeating, oh, what did you mean by that? Or could you, say that again? Or before you said this and now I don't understand. But in fact, even my articulating it makes it sound sort of reified. But it's a process that just goes on in a very natural kind of way.
I'm going to paraphrase, so forgive me or correct me if don't get this quite right. But in the state of mismatch, one of the things that people can experience is this feeling of fear that I don't exist. And that to me is when I read those words, it took 2 or 3 times, because it's in the book 2 or 3 times, I think. And finally, I went to bed and I woke up the next morning and I went, oh my goodness, that's heavy.
The typical mismatch and repair in a healthy relationship that is necessary for growth and development. But when it's X plus Y plus Z, and it's beyond the child's developmental capacity to tolerate, then there's this feeling that the mother doesn't exist. And if the mother doesn't exist, then the child doesn't exist. And that's this kind of what Melanie Klein called the annihilation of the self. That is really probably the most profound psychic pain that a person can have. But I just do want to clarify that it's not the typical, normal, healthy state of things, but it helps the typical and normal helps us to understand when things become so profoundly derailed, and in turn, what to do when someone has that kind of profound psychic pain, to give them an opportunity for more robust mismatch and repair, so that they begin to regain a sense that I exist.
When we're talking about mothers and infants in a typical interaction, the mismatches last a couple of seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, whatever. But in the possibility, for example, of neglect, where a parent really fails for long periods of time to respond to an infant, or if you think of your interactions with a partner, an intimate partner, someone you're really close to, and not that anyone listening ever does this, but you fall into that sort of silent argument between the two of you, and you don't respond to the other person, and you walk past the other person and you're not looking at them, and it goes on for a while. If you think about that feeling, it really has that situation, it has a very profound effect on how disconnected, and you begin to wonder, am I real to this person? Am I real to myself? And certainly if it becomes more and more extreme, it provokes that kind of psychic a really terrible psychic pain.
So there's a counterintuitiveness to re-relating to the struggle that it takes to go through that pain and reconnect with someone. And the concept of blame is so reinforced in the media. It's pervasive in our culture. And so for me, reading your thoughts on blame, and maybe reorienting to the concept of blame, is really, really important.
Yeah, well, I think as soon as you start framing the meaning we make of ourselves in the world in the context of relationships, people start to blame each other. And that blame has such a kind of corrosive effect. Because really, when we talk about relationships, what we're saying is that each person in every relationship has a role to play. So when you think about parents and infants, it's no more the mother's fault or the parents' fault than it's the infant's fault that things get derailed in relationships. And there's always a story that gives meaning to the people involved, and that by focusing on the way that the relationships heal by giving value to the role that each one has to play in the moment by moment interactions. So blame is something we really need to get rid of, and it doesn't serve any purpose other than to make things more difficult.
One of the things that you bring to mind, I hadn't really thought about this in terms of blame. And there's this attitude that's typical of parents, of a newborn and a very young child, of really being, what's the word I want? Perhaps forgiving, where they take the blame onto themselves. Unfortunately, they say, "Well, maybe I wasn't doing the right thing. Maybe it was me," and he's just the sweetest thing ever. And of course, in a way, that too is a fantasy, but it doesn't have any blame attached to it. And with adults, one of the things that would be the parallel in the adult situation is the person who says they're doing the best they can. They're really trying. And it may not be working at the moment, but I know they're trying and I know they're caring. And so you don't get into the issue of blaming the other person, but in a way you get into an attitude of supporting them and seeing yourself as still connected with them and still working to improve what's going on. There's a sort of recognition they're doing the best they can. Maybe I can do the best I can. And we do it in a sense naturally, I think, we're typically with really with our babies. But as we get older and we start ascribing more and more intentionality to our partner and more history and more whatever, we start to say, well, this is your fault. This isn't me. This is you doing this. And then what that does is it shuts down the negotiation because you've already decided what's wrong. And that's why when we talk about the mismatch being the basis for creating something new, if you get the sense that we're mismatching all the time, we're mismatching a lot, then we'll resolve it a lot rather than saying, oh, this is your fault. We're not going to deal with it. You have to deal with it. It just shuts off any of the possibility of change.
So being nice doesn't cut it.
Oh, being nice certainly does cut it. I'm not, I don't advocate for going out there and creating problems. But, in therapeutic settings, sometimes it can be effective to allow the mismatch to last possibly longer than you might want it to, because it generates arousal and it generates the possibility of working on the mismatch rather than just letting it go by.
In the book, if I'm understanding correctly, it's necessary to have the mismatch and repair happen with another human. Is this to exclude solo? Can you experience mismatch and repair internally?
Since we've put the book together and thought about it a lot, I've been thinking a lot about that question, about your own, in a sense, mismatch and repair that's internal. And I'm coming to a view where I think, indeed, there's a lot of self-generated mismatch and repair. Um, One way to think about it is at the physiologic level. Your cortisol can be going up because you're under stress. And at the same time, you have an autonomic nervous system that's trying to calm down your system. So you have one system pushing one way, another system pushing another way. One system is saying, oh, this is frightening. The other system is saying, no, it'll be okay. So there has to be those two levels are mismatching with one another. And the repair is figuring out, yeah, really, I should be frightened and starting to run, or in fact, I can calm down and reorganize my systems. But I think that happens in a lot of other levels. I think the book, the idea of repair and the idea of mismatch is hopefully a really freeing idea, that it allows people to give up the idea that relationships have to be perfect, that you have to be perfect, but that in fact, out of that messiness, out of that imperfection, you can create something new and you can build something that comes out of it. If you're always doing the same thing, you're not going to create something new. You just repetition. And repetition is one of the aspects of psychopathology. When there's messiness, you can take hold of that messiness and try to figure out, oh, what do I do with this? How do I change it? And when you change it, you can build something new. You can build something new in the relationship. You can build something new in yourself. So you can sort of say with your partner when things are getting messy, isn't it great that we're messing up here? Because look what could come out of it. I mean, something really great could come out of it. And while we can all smile about that in relationship, I can tell you with parents, when you get parents to see with their infants and their children that they don't have to be perfect, and that out of the constant negotiation that you're involved with your child, that new things develop and that it's part of development to do that, it is really freeing for them to see that.
When I started this interview with Ed Tronick and Claudia Gold, Ed mentioned there was something important he wanted to share. I offered to start the conversation on that point, but Ed preferred to close with these thoughts.
I think the trauma that arises in relationship, even when there are extreme negative events like fights, domestic fights, rapes, and the like, is that those events have already been occurring in the context of a relationship that is already distorted, that on a daily basis, before the event occurs, there's already something very, very problematic going on. A failure to repair, a disconnection, a constancy of negative affect, all of which is creating a stress on the individual that is constantly stressing them. And then you introduce some quote unquote big event, like getting hit. And now we the therapists, focus on the event of getting hit, that quote unquote is the traumatic event. But the phenomenon, from my perspective, is what makes you so vulnerable to that event, is that you've already come into the situation vulnerable because you haven't had those experiences which allow you to deal with the trauma. So one of the things that comes out of repair is that to the extent that you have repairs, you build up trust in the other person and you build resilience. You talked about skills before. You learn how to overcome the stress of the typical repairs. If you watch kids arguing with one another, they resolve the little argument. Who's going to get the ball, who's going to go first, whatever. All of those things give you experience in figuring out, oh, I can go from being disconnected and angry to being connected and back playing together. And it's a little like running a marathon. You practice for a marathon, you practice your repairs, and you build up a reservoir of capacity. So then you have a big fight with a friend, but now you have a lot of trust in them, and you've learned how to deal with it. You've learned how to repair. But the individual who's in a relationship where at some point you get hit or raped or whatever, those relationships do not have that quality. The daily moment by moment experience is problematic and makes you extremely vulnerable to what we call the traumatic event. And what has to change is not necessarily changing the experience around the traumatic event, which does need to, the hitting or whatever does need to change. But one also has to now face, as a therapist, you have to face the issue of how do we get this person to trust? What kind of skills do they have? What kind of abilities do they have to repair? How can we get them to have a daily life in which they're not walking around feeling threatened all the time? Even if the threat no longer occurs, your experience over 1 billion moments of the relationship have been one where I can't trust you. I don't know what to do. And the world begins to seem to be a place where I can't trust it and I don't know what to do. So the view I have is much more anchored in the moment by moment and the chronicity, the repetition of what your experience is, rather than those big events that we focus on as quote unquote trauma or whatever one wants to call it.
There are so many things I would have liked to discuss with Ed and Claudia, but the design of these podcasts is to give you a sense of what's available right now at TRF, so you can choose where to focus next. For now, I encourage you to register for the 32nd Annual Boston International Trauma Conference if you haven't already. Everything will be presented online. In the meantime, if you're looking for even more resources, remember to check in to the TRF Tuesday workshops, where programming from awesome people like Leisha Skye, Josephine Wickstrom, Linda Tai, and Daphne Lender are all offered in 8-week programs, all for free. The current featured program is called Simple is Profound MNRI Reflex Integration, with practical tools and exercises from the Maskatova method to help your body and the clients you work with become more stress resilient. The folks at the Trauma Research Foundation have been working really hard to make this year's virtual conference a special one. I hope you can make it and be part of the long and deep history of this amazing event. For now, this is James Buffin signing off. Peace, love, and gratitude to you all.